So welcome everybody to Breakout B, Border Policy is an issue of racial justice and safety for victims of gender-based violence. I am Casey Keene with the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence. We're so happy that you're here for the town hall. I'd like to remind you to please limit your use of the chat, help us in keeping the session accessible to all. And I would like to introduce our speaker today, Alba Jaramillo. Is that correct? Alba Jaramillo is the Executive Director of the Arizona Justice for Our Neighbors, a nonprofit organization that provides immigration advocacy and legal services to low-income immigrants and asylum seekers. Alba is recognized as a community leader in the areas of gender-based violence, prevention, immigration, racial justice, and human rights. She has created programs that have served thousands of immigrants in Arizona. Alba currently serves as the co-chair for the Southern Arizona Border Communities Coalition and is an advocacy consultant for the National Justice for Our Neighbors Network. Her passion for immigration and gender-based violence prevention stems from her own experience as a survivor and having grown up in the United States undocumented. So welcome, Alba. Would you like me to share your slides or will you be sharing them?
Let me try to see if I can, if you can share them, because I'm not seeing how to do that.
Absolutely. Pull those up.
And can I switch the slides, or will you be moving the slides?
I believe I will have control since I'm sharing, so you can just let me know and I'll be ready.
Okay, well, thank you everyone for being here. It's a huge honor to be here with you all. As Casey said, I'm here. Well, first of all, I am a child of the border. I was born in Agua Prieta, which is right next to Douglas, Arizona, and I was born a mile from the fence. So I have grown up in the border and currently live in Tucson, Arizona. We are about 45 minutes from the border. I am a survivor, and growing up in the United States undocumented really shaped my desire to work in immigration justice and with the focus also on victims of gender-based violence. So if we can start with the first slide. Okay, so I want to, first of all, mention the issue of migration. There's, so much talk about it, especially this past year. It's in the news all the time, and when we're seeing so much anti-immigrant sentiment in this country, especially during the Trump administration, that it was really out there in front of us. But even now, the policies during this current administration are very anti-immigrant, and I'll get to that. You'll see what I mean in just a second. But when we're looking at immigration, something that is not ever talked about is that currently the face of migration is a woman. At one point, there was major waves of migration coming to the United States, and they tended to be men that would come to the United States to work and then send money back home. So that was especially during the 80s when we had the amnesty program. We would see a lot of men that would come and they would work here and send money back home and then eventually bring their families. That was the trend back in the 80s when we had amnesty. The only time we've had amnesty but now things are different. You know, the current wave of migration is arguably the largest wave of women and children coming to the United States. Women comprise 23 million immigrants in the United States. They are the drivers of citizenship, and they are more likely to come through the family immigration system. When we're talking about asylum, it tends to be mostly, the majority are women and children. In the past couple of years, just between 2018 and 2019, we saw 300,000 migrant women and children come through our southern border. And that was a 54% increase in women. And again, the majority being women, more than men coming to the United States. So all of these policies that we're looking at, immigration policies, we have to look at migration as an issue that impacts women. And when we're looking at anti-immigration policies, the victims of those policies are going to be women and children. And there's just so much to look at when it comes to these issues and how it impacts women and children. The starkest example is the separation of migrant children at the border that happened during the zero tolerance policy during the Trump administration. But so many policies that we'll get into right now have a huge impact on migrant women and children. So when we are hearing anti-immigrant rhetoric, we really need to analyze that from a gender perspective and really understand that this anti-immigrant rhetoric is really targeting women and children. Next slide. So another issue, and actually the topic of our conversation, is gender-based violence. So when we're looking at asylum and the current waves of migration coming to the border, it is an issue of gender-based violence, and it is a driving factor for asylum. And so when we're looking at, why are migrants coming to the border? The issue and the analysis of gender-based violence is one that we need to take into consideration. And so I work for Arizona Justice for Our Neighbors. Our organization focuses on immigration advocacy and legal services. And we have an asylum program in the Nogales Port of Entry where we go into Mexico and help asylum seekers access the asylum system, obtain humanitarian parole to enter the United States, and also understand asylum law. So over the past, I would say since about March, we have secured about 500 migrants, asylum seekers getting entry to the United States. Again, the vast majority of them have been women and children, and a huge percentage of them have been women that were fleeing gender-based violence. So I want to share just three stories so that you can get an idea of what it is like, what it is these asylum seekers are fleeing from. So the example of Itzel. Itzel is a Mayan Indigenous woman from Guatemala. She showed up with her 3 children at the Nogales Port of Entry requesting asylum. She and her children speak Conjobal, it's a Mayan dialect, and they're unable to communicate in Spanish. And for that reason, they're extremely vulnerable asylum seekers. Itzel has experienced years of physical, sexual, and emotional violence from her husband. He has attempted to kill her with a machete several times and tried to run her over with his car. She is too scared to report him to the police. And if she remains in Guatemala, she fears that he will kidnap the children. Which that is actually a trend that I'm seeing with a lot of the asylum seekers, the issue of kidnapping the children. That is an issue of power and control that we see a lot in Latin America. Okay, the case of Marina. Marina is a Mixtec Indigenous woman from Guerrero whose Spanish-speaking skills are limited. She's almost completely blind. She arrived at the Nogales Port of Entry with her 3 children requesting asylum because she fears that Saul, who is the father of her children, will murder her and kidnap the children. Marina began living with Saul when she was 15 years old, and unbeknownst to her at the time, he was a major cartel leader. She was pregnant when she moved in with him. The pregnancy was the result of a rape from another man in her village. The minute Marina gave birth, Saul took the baby from her arms at the bed, and the child was sold. She never saw that child again, and she endured many years of physical abuse from Saul. He would often beat her, choke her, leaving her unconscious. He threatened to kill her, burn her house down if she ever tried to leave him, and she was terrified of him because of his involvement in the cartel. And she often moves from shelter to shelter because she believes that if she stays in one place too long, Saul or the cartel will find her. And lastly, the story of Luis. Luis is a 17-year-old unaccompanied minor from Guerrero. He is gay and he is out. When he was 5 years old, armed men broke into his house, killed his mother. He never met his father. His aunt and uncle took over the care of Luis and his siblings. For 6 years, Luis' uncle sexually abused him. He never told anyone. Since 11 years of age, Luis has been living on his own, supporting himself. He experienced constant harassment for his sexual orientation. He doesn't feel safe and was recently assaulted on his way home from work for being gay. He showed up at the Nogales port of entry requesting asylum because he desperately wants to live in a home and he desperately wants an adult to take care for him. He doesn't feel safe in Mexico because he is gay. So those are three real stories of 3 asylum seekers that we helped attain humanitarian parole. So as you can see, and many stories like this. You know, a lot of times people think that asylum seekers come to the border because they want a better job, because they want to come live in the United States. I have not met a single asylum seeker in just this year. I've personally met with over 500 of them, and not a single one of them is coming to the United States because they want to make money or because they want a better job. They're coming here because if they stay in the if they stay in their home countries, they will be killed. And gender-based violence is something that is not talked about. That is one of the driving causes of people fleeing to the border. Okay, next slide. So when we're looking at gender-based violence as a driving factor for asylum, violence against Indigenous women is one thing we need to consider. A lot of that, especially like in the state of Guerrero, a lot of Mexican asylum seekers are coming from Guerrero, and because they're really living in a warlike situation in that state, and in the violence against the cartel violence has a huge impact against Indigenous communities, and 60% of those victims are Indigenous. And we know that in Indigenous communities in Central America and in Mexico, 66% of the Indigenous women have experienced some form of gender-based violence. We know that feminicides, when we're looking at Mexico, the Northern Triangle, which is Central America, Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, have the highest feminicides in the world, and huge impunity. 93% of cases of gender-based violence are not reported and they're not investigated. So when we're looking at the highest feminicides in the world, that is something we really need to consider, and that is driving people, victims to come to the border. Latin America and the Caribbean account for 14 of the 25 deadliest nations in the world regarding killings regarding gender-based violence. So it's a real serious issue. And when we're talking about LGBTQ, also, LGBTQ, when we're looking at Latin America and all of the homophobia and the violence against LGBTQ, it is also a driving factor for those victims seeking asylum in the United States. And when it comes to LGBTQ victims in Mexico, for example, only 10% of those crimes against LGBTQ were actually even considered to be hate crimes. And and almost absolutely no convictions for killings of LGBTQ. We're looking at in Mexico, 94% of killings and disappearance are not even investigated. And when we're looking at cartel violence and gender-based violence go hand in hand. Often, the women are sold into human trafficking, the girls are sold into human trafficking. And when you see heavy militarization in the cartels, sexual violence is actually used as a weapon of war. So we know in Mexico, at least 160,000 people have been displaced because of cartel violence, and 60% of those people are indigenous. And 71,000 have been disappeared. And again, 94% of these crimes are not even investigated. So that is why people are coming to the border when it comes to gender-based violence. Next slide. So there's the issue of what happens, gender-based violence being a driving factor for people fleeing the border. And then there's the issue of gender-based violence in the journey to the United States. 60% of asylum seekers that come to the border have witnessed some form of violent crime. And 40% of them, those violent crimes have been against their person. And we know that one out of six migrant women, 1 out of 6 asylum seekers taking that journey through Mexico will be sexually assaulted in their journey to the United States. So it's a really, really dangerous journey to take. And I'm going to get to, we're going to get to talking about what just happened at Del Rio. But 2 out of 3 of the asylum seekers that were expelled back to Haiti were women and children. And it's so cruel that this happened, because the journey to even get to the border is one that is so dangerous. And there is a reason that people come in caravans. And people are not discussing that, because if you come by yourself through the Mexican country, if you get to the border, chances are you will be assaulted, you will be extorted. If you're a woman, chances are you will be sexually assaulted. And so sometimes traveling in caravans is the only safe way to get to the United States border. And again, for many of them is, the only safe way, to seek asylum, to be able to save their lives. Next slide. So let's look at the current border asylum policies, and we'll start with Title 42. So Title 42 is the legislation. It's actually not even immigration policy. It is a public health policy. It's called, the CDC Public Health Order. And this policy has been in the book since the 1940s. And so that public health policy gives the United States power to close the land borders if there is any risk of a communicable disease. So it's been around since the 40s, and no one had ever invoked it until the Trump administration. So you would think that the reason Title 42 is there is because of the coronavirus. Yeah, that is what the government is saying. But actually, Stephen Miller, who was leading Department of Homeland Security during the Trump administration, attempted twice to invoke Title 42 as, saying, migrants can bring measles and the mumps to the United States. So let's invoke Title 42 even before the coronavirus existed. But he wasn't successful until COVID-19 happened. And so it became a tactic, an anti-immigration tactic to close the borders and prevent migrants from entering the country. So you would think it would make sense, close the borders, to prevent the further spread of COVID-19. In reality, when Title 42 was invoked, the United States actually were the ones that had the largest percentage of coronavirus, and we were more of a threat to people entering the border, and we were more of a threat to Latin America in terms of spreading COVID-19. But for the almost 2 years now, Title 42 has existed. The borders have been closed, and asylum seekers have been turned away at the border, unable to request asylum because of this regulation, which is actually unlawful and contrary to our national and domestic law. So it, and not only that, it is not even successful in preventing the further spread of COVID-19. Um, Fauci Dr. Anthony Fauci has even said that Title 42 is not the solution to the COVID-19 outbreak. In reality, what Title 42 has resulted in is further endangering the lives of migrants and asylum seekers at the borders. There have been almost 8,000 kidnappings and attacks against asylum seekers because they are forced to remain in Mexico. And they're also, they congregate in asylum shelters, sometimes in asylum camps, and they're easy targets for organized crimes, and they're easy targets for kidnappers. So many things happen. And then there's the issue of expulsions. So under Title 42, almost 900,000 migrants, asylum seeker have been expelled. That means that they went through the border and they were sent back to Mexico or to their home countries under Title 42. This is the largest deportations we have seen in the history of our country, happening currently during this administration. Now we know that it is over the summer, there were two legal avenues in being able to allow migrants to enter the country as exceptions to Title 42. And our organization was one of the organizations that actually helped request Title 42 exemptions for asylum seekers and migrants, and we succeeded in getting almost 500 asylum seekers through, the most vulnerable. But we were able to test every single one of them. And every single one of them that got through the border was tested negative for, actually out of 1,200 migrants that went through our Nogales port of entry, only 5% were even positive for COVID-19, and they isolated, they quarantined until they tested negative. So that example shows that there is actually ways to get people through the border as exceptions to Title 42 in a way that is safe and that protects public health. But what I will let you know is that once we got them through, those that were not traveling with children were automatically put in ICE detention, in immigration detention, and many of them contracted COVID-19 in the immigration detention facilities. So that really makes no sense. You should know also that on November 8th, the land borders will open up to tourists, not to asylum seekers. And so if the borders is going to open up to tourists, then why do we still have Title 42? It really makes absolutely no sense. The other policy, the migrant protection protocols, is, it's really an improper name. We call it the migrant persecution protocol. What that means is that any migrant who is not of Mexican descent that comes to the border has to fight their entire asylum case from the Mexican border. And a typical asylum case often lasts 5 years. These asylum seekers live in asylum camps. There's only a few courts, Ciudad Juarez being one of them, which is one of the most dangerous cities in the world. And they have to remain in Mexico during the entire duration of their asylum case. It is, where they're exposed to violence, where they're targeted by human traffickers. So it is an extremely cruel policy. We were hoping, and initially the Biden administration issued an order to end the migrant protection protocol, and a court in Texas struck it down. And so the administration had the opportunity to rewrite another regulation that would survive a lawsuit. And instead, last week, they put the migrant protection protocol back in place. So, I mean, it is just so cruel. Now, the issue of expulsions, I mentioned that these asylum seekers, once they step on US ground, under international law, they should be allowed the right to claim asylum. Instead, they have been illegally expelled back to either Mexico or Central America. And it's been 900,000 migrants during the past year and a half that have been expelled. So, and I also want to say ICE flights, these are flights, the deportation flights. Just last month, we hit a record. Just in September, 766 ICE flights occurred. And since the Biden administration took office, there have been almost 4,000 deportation flights that have happened. And that is a 25% increase than the Trump administration. The flights that occurred last month, half of them were flights that were removal flights to Haiti. So what is going on here? And I keep on mentioning the current administration because a lot of promises were made, and a lot of promises that were made were not being kept. And what we're seeing is, especially when it comes to asylum, is that the situation is much worse now than it was during the Trump administration, which is an irony. Next slide. So when we're looking at, that is the current landscape when it comes to asylum right now. This town hall is focused on the southern region of the United States, and I'm posing some questions here for us to look at this issue of prevention and intervention. And one thing I really advocate for is that when we're looking at prevention, gender-based violence prevention, we need to look at the issues of policy. And we need to analyze our policy, and we need to make sure that we're not implementing national policies that are further endangering the lives of migrants and specifically victims of gender-based violence. The current policies, border policies that we have right now, make it a very easy environment, especially with Title 42 MPP for the perpetration of gender-based violence against migrants. But I want us to ask ourselves, for all of us work here with victims, how are we exploring our humanitarian response to asylees fleeing gender-based violence? So are the domestic violence program and shelters working in partnership with humanitarian groups? In our ports of entries here in Arizona, they are not. They're working completely independently. There is really no collaboration. Is our asylum shelter system effective when it comes to serving these victims? Why not create a shelter system that is specific to asylum seekers and refugees that are coming through our borders, that looks at the intersection of immigration and all of the violence that they may have experienced in their journey to the United States, as well as and the reason for fleeing their home countries. So right now, it is not trauma informed in that sense, that the humanitarian system and the gender-based violence system I hope I'm wrong. And if there is, I would, models in your communities, I would love, to hear about them. And perhaps, at the end of the presentation, you can let us know. But right now, at least in our state, we're not seeing any collaboration. We're not seeing any prevention or information being provided to the victims themselves. Migrants coming to the United States are also at a higher risk of perpetration for gender-based violence. And also, is there access to language justice, legal services, social services, and what type of prevention work is being done for asylum seekers? Are our programs even responsive to Indigenous asylum seekers? I'll tell you that for us to even find interpreters is a challenge, because our networks here in Arizona are not even set up to actually provide language justice. Next slide. Now, moving away from asylum and looking at our border policies and how it's currently impacting immigrant survivors already in the United States. That is also another issue. We currently have we know that at least 11 million undocumented immigrants live in the United States. And currently with no pathways to citizenship and legalization. It is, if you're paying attention to what's going on during the reconciliation process, we can't even pass meaningful immigration reform so that these migrants have legalization in the United States. We have a Democratic executive. We have a Democratic Congress. We have a Democratic Senate, and we cannot pass any meaningful immigration reform through reconciliation, not even for the most sympathetic migrants that are like DACA, COVID-19 first responders, farm workers, not even, there's absolutely no way to get access to citizenship. And, and a lot of times people will say, well, why don't migrants just get in line? Well, because there's no lines to get in. There is no pathway to citizenship. If there was a line to get in, then migrants would wait in line. But the only way you can become a lawful resident in the United States, really, if it's not through an immigration humanitarian remedy, which very few are successful, only about 13% of those asylum seekers are even going to succeed in their asylum case. And in Latin America, about 90% of them will fail in their asylum case, especially if they don't have access to an attorney. But if we can't even pass immigration reform right now, what does that say about our current system and the immigrant, anti-immigrant sentiments and xenophobia that exist among our own elected officials? But so looking at border policies and the impact that it has on migrant survivors, all of us are in the southern part of the country, and we have to look at, the impact that the militarization of our border is having on immigrant victims. And so what do I mean by militarization of our border? Well, that is really, using military techniques and philosophies to patrol our borders. It is the idea that immigrants, which in itself is anti-immigrant, that immigrants themselves are a threat to the national security of this country. And so it involves a lot of military force, military equipment, military philosophy. I mean, even, just what they call the policies, Operation Streamline, Operation Stone Garden, Operation Stone Hold the Line. All of those are military names for the immigration policies. And it involves, filling our borders with border patrol and law enforcement. So currently, Border Patrol is the largest law enforcement agency in the world, with over 60,000 agents on the ground in our southern border. So in Tucson, for example, just Tucson, there is 11 checkpoints. I mean, can you imagine what that is for, what that feels like for an immigrant person to be constantly being surveilled, to be in constant police and border patrol presence? And I will tell you, as a formerly undocumented person, that for me, growing up undocumented in Arizona, to me, the Border Patrol and the police were the same entity. So when I was driving, which I didn't have a driver's license, I didn't have lawful permission to drive. If I saw a Border Patrol, like if I was going to the grocery store and I saw a Border Patrol or a police car, I would immediately leave that store and go someplace else, because my heart would start beating, because even though I was doing nothing wrong, I had never committed any sort of a crime. That very act of being an undocumented migrant really put me in fear. And as you know, for those of you that work with victims, that they don't report incidences of gender-based violence because they don't trust the police. And so when we're looking at Border Patrol And, and a lot of people say, well, we need Border Patrol on the borders because they also help save lives. Well, the data has shown that they don't show up to 65% of calls that they get for migrants dying in the desert of heat exhaustion. In 66% of the cases, they don't show up. And when they do show up, for search and rescue operations, they don't put the same amount of resources that they would for for a migrant, that they would for a U.S. citizen. I mean, can you imagine? We saw the case of the big national case of the white woman that was disappeared recently. I mean, we see this all the time with migrants, all the time, women being disappeared, and not once is there any mobilization in our desert to save these women. So I mean, that is one of the things that we need to consider. And I want to say 287G agreements and what that is. Also, I want to mention Operation Stone Garden. So these agreements are cooperative agreements that are local communities and local police office, police entities have directly with Department of Homeland Security to enforce immigration policy. So the way that these work, 287 agreements, 287G agreements are all out through the southern border, and Texas being the one state that has the most. And so what that means usually is that the police will call Border Patrol, we'll cooperate, we'll give numbers of immigrants, we'll place, ICE in the local jails, and also Operation Stone Garden, that is money that is giving directly to the hands of local law enforcement to enforce immigration policy. And the cops love it. The sheriffs love it because it pays for the salaries of their officers, and it increases the number of cops that they have, and they're able to buy equipment and pay for overtime and increase police presence. But all of that is blood money. All of that comes with immigration enforcement. So that is, when we're talking about racial justice, we know that the involvement of police is not in line with racial justice. We know that police enforcement does target people of color, and it and this is a perfect example of when we're looking at cooperative agreements. It is an issue of racial justice. It is further criminalizing our migrant community, and it is creating fear. And we have also shown, studies have shown that these cooperative agreements do not bring any additional safety to our border communities. They are detrimental. So if we're looking at survivors, if someone is sexually assaulted, and especially if they live in a border community, they're not going to call the police, but also, are they even going to go to the hospital if they have to drive through a checkpoint? It is absolutely cruel. It is keeping them from accessing safety. And the issue of criminalization of migrants. So I want to mention Operation Streamline, another operation, and this exists all throughout the southern border, that any migrant that comes undocumented through the border is then criminalized, and they're charged with federal crimes. And the way this happens, if you can imagine this, and again, an issue of racial justice, because can you imagine a white person going through this? So they do mass migration hearings, and these are not even deportations hearings. These are criminal hearings in federal courtrooms where migrants, about 80% of them, 80 of them at a time, in mass, go to their hearings. They're all shackled together. And I mean, if you ever have a chance to actually go witness this, you need to go see this, because it is an absolute violation of due process. And they all stand up, all 80 of them, shackled together, and they plead guilty at the same time. I mean, would this ever happen, to a US citizen, to a white criminal defendant? We would not allow for that. But somehow, for our or migrants that are people of color, everyone is okay with this. And that, in these courts, there is 3 big courts. One of them is in Tucson, but usually migrants are criminally prosecuted all throughout the southern border. And you have to know that immigration policy is actually a civil violation. Immigration law is an issue of civil law, not criminal law. But since 1994, under the Clinton administration, through IRA, now all of a sudden, just the act of being undocumented became a criminal issue, and through Operation Streamline, it even becomes a felony, where these migrants, for the very act, many of them asylum seekers, are actually criminally prosecuted. So that is an issue of that is happening all throughout the southern border. Next slide. So the intersection of racial justice and immigration justice. We all saw the cruelty of what happened at Del Rio. This issue of the expulsions of 7,000 migrants that came, to Del Rio is a perfect example. And, I didn't put the picture that was all over the media, of the Border Patrol with the whip and the migrants, because it is such a triggering image. But if you saw it, think about that, or look at the image that we're looking at right now, which is women and children. 2/3 of the 7,000 Haitians that were expelled were women and children. And they were Black migrants. This is an issue of racial justice. And we often, we often think of the migrant being a brown person. No, the face of the migrant is also a Black migrant. And what happened at Del Rio under this current administrations is anti-Blackness. And it is an absolute travesty of justice that they were not allowed to claim asylum, getting their lawful right, and that they were actually, within less than a week, they were essentially disappeared in all of these flights, sent back in less than a week. And what it took for these migrants to get there, the journey to the border, and it is an absolute cruelty, and it is an absolute act of racism. But we have to look at these issues and all of the intersections, and look at racial justice and the anti-Blackness that is also happening with these policies under this administration. And so that is one of I ask all of us to explore what are the local policies happening in our border communities. And when we're looking at intervention, when we're looking at prevention, we have to look at the issues of migration, and we have to stay on top of that. And it's really hard, even for us attorneys, because it changes so much. And we have to start looking at this issue as an issue of racial justice as well. So we only have 7 minutes left. So I'm going to stop here, and I want to provide people with the opportunity to either ask questions or tell us what is happening with immigration in your local community.
Thank you so much, Alba. What a powerful presentation. You've illuminated so much for us. I really would like to invite all of you to come onto camera so we can have a little discussion. You can pose questions. I would welcome you to unmute and share whatever questions you may have for Alba, or reactions, or sort of how you're approaching this work. I think I jotted down so many notes, and just the way that you sort of illuminated the dehumanizing practices and policies, I think is such an important opportunity when it comes to our prevention work. And the way you described the complex trauma that migrants and asylum seekers are experiencing, I think we need to prioritize better options for safety and justice. We clearly need to work on decriminalization. So as people are considering their questions, I really welcome you to share. I wonder, Alba, if you can, share more about what those prevention strategies really should focus on so that we can center the experiences and the needs of asylum seekers?
Well, I think, it is really important for all of the gender-based violence centers to have a person, that is constantly following the policies and informing the staff about that. There are so many things, an asylum seeker only has 1 year to claim asylum. If, once they get through the border, if they don't, they forever lose their opportunity. The issues of the regulations, even outside of asylum, are always changing. And so I think, one of the ways is we need to stay on top of that. Assigning a point person in organizations is one start. But I think also the partnership between the gender-based violence movement and the humanitarian groups and the immigration movement need to come together. Right now, I'm from both worlds. But I see these movements working apart where they can complement each other. And so that, the immigration advocates often do not have a background or understanding of gender-based violence, much less prevention. So if there is partnerships and shared strategy making, shared movement, then we can work together and actually change policies more effectively.
Thank you. Hi, Rita. Do you have a question for Alba?
I do. Thank you, Alba, for your time and for sharing all this information today. Yeah, I had a question around, are there any international groups that you can share either now or at a later time about across borders where we could be developing stronger partnerships? So, I know, I believe it was like last year in Mexico City, there was a large protest in response to femicide. And so I'm just wondering if you have any recommendations about building international solidarity around these issues.
That's a great question. And this is the issue of binational cooperation is one strategy that is not used that often. And so there is major organizations, of course, the UN has several, that are doing this direct services. And of course, the UN, UNHCR, UNICEF, they do have an expertise, and especially around issues of women and children and gender-based violence. So that would be one to cooperate with. Save the Children is another one. There's several big ones. But, I will tell you, it has been my experience, because I am in a border community, that the big organizations are not as effective. We see that too, like with sometimes national groups in our own, country that, I'm not discounting national groups are important, but often national groups are not the answer. And because they don't understand locally what is happening. And so what I would encourage is to reach out to your local border communities, because it's often the smaller nonprofits that actually that are doing the work on the ground and that have the expertise and the resources in those particular ports of entry. So that takes a little bit more work, but taking the time to do that and building capacity, I think is actually more effective than the big international NGOs. Great question.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rita. Do others have questions? Looks like we have about 2 minutes left. Sarah, hi.
Hi, Alba. Thank you so much. This was illuminating, and as a newer member to an organization in Ohio that does violence prevention work, I would love to know your thoughts on, as we are kind of not necessarily considered a border state or have the borders, readily available for us working directly with folks, what might we be doing to support that work within Ohio, especially as we actually expand our funding to really focus in on immigration, public policy work, as well as working with survivors, migrant survivors.
And you're in Ohio, you said? Or
Yes.
Okay, great question. Well, first of all, in asylum, the ports of entry, the southern border are gateways. They're pass-through state, but most asylum seekers do not stay in the border. Most asylum seekers, so the issue of asylum is actually an issue that concerns all of the United States, and every single state is impacted by it. So Ohio is a state that has a lot of refugees. And so I think it's the same thing, the same strategy, because they just go through the border, but eventually they're going to come to your state. And so building capacity and resources in your state is even more important. So I think you're taking the exact approach that you need to take, because at the end, you're going to be the one that is providing the services.
So with 7 seconds remaining, I think we're all going to be sent back to the main room. Just a lot of gratitude for everything you shared with us today, Alba. Thank you for your leadership in this work and in the town hall. This is a great session. We really appreciate you. Bye, everybody.